as you know, today we are joined by international best-selling author of the Michelangelo Project, Making It in the Digital Century, Isabel Wu. So some of the key points she will be covering tonight are: what is the digital century workforce, why we should focus on capability and not skills, and what is the future of work. And the future is of work, not of jobs. Isabel Wu is an expert in organizational behavioral methods. She uses this to help leaders achieve high performance, especially in times of change. So right now we could use her skills the most. For almost 2 decades, she's been doing this work. She focuses on the digital workforce and how technology is changing the way organizations and people work. So Isabel, thank you so much for joining us today. And once again, thank you everybody for tuning in. I will hand over the reins to you.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you for organising this presentation tonight. It's just wonderful to be able to get together, even though I'd much rather see everyone in person. But we can't, so I'm grateful for whatever we do have. Before I begin, I would just like to make my acknowledgements of the traditional owners of the land on which I'm presenting today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also to the Aboriginal elders of the communities from where you might be joining me today. So, as Kate mentioned, I am going to talk about the future of work, but I thought I'd start my presentation by going backwards in time. In 1884, there was an Austrian physician by the name of Ignaz Semmelweis. Apologies to the Austrians for my pronunciation. Now, he upset the medical fraternity because he ordered his staff to wash their hands before they went into the maternity ward where he was in charge. Maternity deaths were quite high, and at the time medical doctors said that was just part of nature and there was nothing you could do about it. When he started this hand washing routine, the medical industry or professionals so insulted that they caused for him to be sacked from his job, and he couldn't find work anywhere for quite some time, eventually except in one hospital where he was appointed and was able to reduce the death rate of mothers and babies by over 90%. So although the medical authorities continued to attack him, he persisted. He continued to promote his ideas about hygiene and sanitization of the medical areas, and the importance of keeping clean environments. It would be too late for Semmelweis by the time the medical profession realised that that was actually very good advice. They had him confined against his will into a mental asylum. He was bashed and he died from an infection 2 weeks after his confinement. And I use that story because it's so hard sometimes to spot the changes when they're coming. We might get some clues, we might get some unusual hints, we might have some statistics that we find ways to explain. But when the data doesn't fit the frameworks that we have, instead of recognising cracks in our current systems, quite often what we do is we dig in and we find a way to discredit the new information and demonstrate the importance of the existing information. Now, for the doctors of the day, the medical profession believed in humours, which was the imbalance of the human body. And they used to do quite spectacular demonstrations of bloodletting as a way of showing how they were treating their patients. And so hand washing, of course, went against that. It didn't show them to be very special at all. And so as a profession, they rejected that, that new philosophy. That's not an unusual story. Many of you might remember some of these quotes. When the founder of Warner Brothers asked who the hell wants to hear actors talk, when the Western Union refused to buy the telephone because they thought it was a toy, and when no one thought personal computers would be available or even necessary for for individual domestic use. And we've seen the same ridicule for photocopiers, for steam trains, for cars, and so on. what happens is a threatened industry doesn't accept change because it invests so much in the professions that they've developed. Now, going back just a little bit further, there was a person by the name of John Kay. He was the inventor of the Flying Shuttle, and he patented that invention in 1733. Why that invention is so important is because that one thing, a tiny device which allowed a single person, a single weaver, to weave cloth by just pulling on a cord, that triggered the Industrial Revolution. And of course, 250 years later, we're now in the fourth Industrial Revolution. The invention that he made, the simple device, had actually been the first change in weaving for thousands of years. And instead of an industry thinking that he should be celebrated, they banded together to try to hound him. They even petitioned the king, King George II at the time, to ban him and his inventions. When eventually they started to use it because they could see the benefits, they refused to pay the royalties that he was owed. And in the end, John Kay retreated to France and he died obscure a few years later. We've got an invention that we've been using for the last mainly 100 years, and that's the invention of jobs. And the job is, even though we see it as a fixture today, it's actually what William Bridges, the author of a book called Job Shift, called a social artifact. He says it's so contemplate a world without it. Even though at the time it was considered a threat to man, and there were many protests against the implementation of jobs. And today we see it as an ultimate in our success. And few artifacts have, over our last few centuries, have done for us what a job has done. We not only use it to survive, we use it as part of our lifestyle. We even, in some cases, think it's equal to life itself. And the ultimate symbol of fulfillment is a job. That our devotion to jobs is absolute now, so much so that even when we've got jobs that really aren't that great, they might be insecure, they might not pay well, they might not be fulfilling, they might be bad for us, they might be bad for our planet, they might be for people that we don't agree with either morally, ethically, or we have legal concerns, but we still protect them. And what's interesting about reviewing the course of history that we've come from is to learn that this was not an accident of history, it was deliberate, it was actually how we made progress. So as you probably know or can tell, I've always been a little bit of a history buff, not because I'm interested so much in the facts and figures, but because it helps me understand human behaviour, and organisational behaviour is of course made up of many humans working and interacting together. Being able to live through the 21st century, or the turn of the century, has been a unique opportunity, I think, for all of us, because we're actually not just observing history, we're living and participating in history in the making. And that really was the trigger behind me putting my research and my experience into a book. I was very gratified and humbled by the reviews that I've had, which I'm very pleased to share with you, and to see it reach bestseller status. If this topic interests you, then I'm happy to announce that we'll be offering a discount on the book, and I'll share those details later on. So ever since the internet has come about, we've started to change the way we work. And as we've changed the way we work, we've been able to change what we do, why we do it, how we do it. And that's been a great success story. It's actually the greatest success story of our human history. And just this quick chart gives you a very easy way to see what's so special about the inventions that we've made, particularly in the last 50 years or so. It's propelled us from having centuries of very little change in our human condition to achieving great advances in all respects. But none of this would happen unless we have one thing, and that one thing is consumers. No consumers, no growth. And anyone who has spent any time in business, obviously, we know that very well. And what was an important realization around 250 years ago was that the only way to get consumers was to give people jobs. And so we have this situation where today we have jobs made for us because we've got goods made for us. Now the equation is to give people enough earnings so that they can buy, and to make sure the things they make are cheap enough to buy. So we don't want people to earn too much because the goods will be expensive, and we don't want to make goods expensive, so we don't want to make our wages so low that people can't buy. And that really is a very simple description of our whole economic model today, our whole management model today, and our social concepts of living wages. But where it is grounded is this idea of the master-servant relationship. Very early on in the Industrial Revolution, there was a concerted effort by industrialists to make sure that all workers would retain the status of servants and all employers would retain the status of masters. And that still exists today in countries like Australia, US, UK, Singapore, and many countries around the world. In fact, if you go into, just have to look at the Fair Work cases that question the right of an employer to do certain things, and there's inevitably a reference back to the right of the master. And it's such an antiquated concept now, but if you consider that our whole industrial relation system is built on it, it starts to make sense why our system of jobs is starting to lose a little bit of favour and starting to lose a little bit of relevance. The answer to this idea of keeping people as servants, obviously the masters or the employers didn't run around the world telling people that their workers were their servants, because that wouldn't have been very enticing. So they used to talk up the workers and call them things like, and we hear it, we still hear it, things like our greatest asset and so on. But what sat behind that wasn't a desire to put the workers on equal footing to employers. The whole goal of it was to make employees feel better about being servants. So asset replaced the word servant and so on. And just this little image, which many of you I'm sure will recognize, is the Pavlovian effect. And that was just one of the many, many, many experiments that were conducted to see how we could change worker behavior to make them more motivated. So moving forward then, most of our time in the 20th century, so since the Great Depression, was for jobs that gave us stability and longevity. So the greatest attribute we could earn as employees once upon a time, just a few decades ago, was to be loyal and to stay with our employer as a loyal worker. And things like the Great Depression, a couple of world wars, Cold War, made it easy to understand why we wanted a lot of stability in our lives. The ultimate goal for us all was peaceful retirement, to go back to our suburbs, to tend our mortgage-free houses and to spend time with our grandchildren. But that's been gone for years now. The job for life is gone. Globalization has forced us into competition. That means flexibility is more important than stability. And the geographical barriers to competition have also gone. So today we could be applying for work and there will be people applying from all sorts of other countries, and depending on your field of work, that could be places like India, Ukraine, the South Americas, because labour is cheaper there. And over the last few decades, I think we've all come to terms with the fact that we not only will have a job for life is no longer there, but we probably don't even want a job for life anymore. What we do want is the career, the perfect career. That means that we can do not just what we want, but how we want. And if we're going to have that career, we've actually learned that we have to make it ourselves. And that's the new opportunity that's opened up for us. Careers no longer are limited to the positions that our employers can offer us. So most people today realise that the old job system has many flaws. We realise that the golden trinity is security and satisfaction and self-actualization, and that we're not going to find it in one job. We're probably not going to find it with one employer, but we're going to find it if we can make up our career of many endeavours. Our main jobs, our side hustles, our startups, our projects. And this is probably the single greatest characteristic of the 21st century workforce. We have not just progressed into multiple jobs and multiple careers, but also multiple formats of work. And the accessibility of technology just makes this not only possible, but available to everyone. So the internet has become the great stabilizer. So the rest of this presentation, I would like to just concentrate on these two questions. And I assume that you are here because these questions are important to you. And they are, how can you do the work you want, when and how you want it, not worry about a job? And how can you do that even in turbulent times? So if you're interested in that, I'd like to perhaps talk about these turbulent times we have today, and just think back only a decade or so ago to the GFC that happened between 2007 and 2008. And it's actually really important that we refer to the GFC because it gives us a template for how we can work today. Many things about the GFC are quite similar today. Sudden job loss, sudden fear of the unknown. We were just unsure of what the future was going to look like. But what happened in 2007 changed the course of history. And that one thing was the smartphone. So 2007 was also the first year of the iPhone. And what happened then was the GFC showed us, was basically caused by greed, Wall Street greed specifically. And with our smartphone, we actually could do something about it that we just didn't have the ability to do before. We could buy, we could sell, we could organize, we could get our own finance, we could share information, we could collect information, we could measure and track everything from our goods we ordered to our health to our nutrition, and we could do it all on our own terms. We just didn't have to go through the institutions anymore. And what that's done, as you might have experienced yourself, is when we opened up with our smartphones, we didn't just change what jobs we could do, we could change how we could work. We could change work that we didn't want to do for someone else into work that we could do for ourselves. We could change the people that we worked with that we didn't agree with and start look for jobs that had a purpose that we wanted to be sharing our time and efforts on. And of course, that's really significant to today. And even though we don't have a new equivalent of a smartphone, we certainly do have a jump in technology again. And every time there's a jump in technology, there is a jump in the way we work. After the GFC, we did have a recovery. And because the world didn't fall apart the way we thought it would at the time, and again, we're hearing the same things, you know, is the world going to fall apart? In the last crisis, the jobs recovered, but not in the way we thought. Different jobs recovered and a lot fewer jobs recovered. But because enough recovered, we didn't worry about it as much as we should. And that brings us back to our analogy we have of the medical profession earlier. So we tend to focus on the peripheral instead of the principle. In their case, the peripheral was hand washing instead of the principle about being sanitized. And in our way, we're taking too much notice of the types of jobs instead of the structure of jobs. And that's not been helped by the federal government's change to education, as you may have seen in the news, the change from the types of courses that will get the amount of funding to try to funnel us into what they think are jobs of the future. And that simply creates this complacency and a false sense of security about how jobs are found, because the type of job has a lot less to do with your job success than you may think. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on. After the GFC, so what we know from our experience today is that we went from being consumerists, we bought all sorts of goods, fast fashion, fast anything, and we decided that experiences were a much better way to live, not only better for our lifestyle, it was better for our planet, and it was better for our relationships. So we shifted, and this chart shows that every demographic segment shifted to greater spending, some more than others, greater spending towards experiences. The coronavirus is going to be different in some respects, but we should be starting to anticipate the same sort of shifts. What shift is it? We have a different type of distrust. The GFC was a distrust in corporates and government. The coronavirus is a distrust not so much in other people, but in what other people could be doing to us. And that both changed our idea of normal, and both have increased the use of technology. So when we look at what we could be doing to improve our careers now, we have this great model from just a few years ago to draw on. So bringing us back to the topic of today, if we want to achieve the career success in the way we define it, then we need to evaluate the systems that we're using and think about whether the ones that we've been using for jobs in the past decade or two, which were developed for last century, starting 250 years ago, whether or not that's the right model that we should be using today. And I'm going to suggest that it's not. But I will quote the great ironically, industrialist W. Edwards Deming, who said, "You cannot achieve a name unless you have a method." And he, if you're not familiar with the name, is the father of systems thinking. So our 3- and 4-year degrees, topped up with intermittent training, represented by CVs, matched to job descriptions, are they really going to give you the fulfilling, sustaining, secure work that you want? Is it going to give you a secure, renewable career? Or in Deming's word, is that the right method to achieve your aim of your career aspirations in a digitally reconfigured world? And there are a couple of areas where I'll show you that it won't. Okay, using an old system for today's world is a little bit like trying to put your Microsoft Office 95 on your new Windows 10 computer. They both might work, but they're just not going to work very well together. We're rounding the corner of the second decade of the 21st century now, and I think we can safely say that given the progress that we've made over time, probably far too many people are feeling unfulfilled, uncertain, maybe bored at work, maybe fearful at work, and just not feeling the progress that they would really like to have. And it's been creeping up on us for a few years now. It's slow moving, but its impact has been is being felt now, and especially when a shock occurs. And the problem is that the past systems that we use were all molded around what employers want. What employer wants this skill, I'll go get it. Employer wants that behavior, I'll go and do it. But careers today should be about what we want and finding the common ground between them. When we think we know what an employer wants, we're just guessing, not because we think employers don't know what they're doing, but employers don't know what's around the corner either. And the last few months have shown that we've all been caught out with something that we couldn't have guessed at all. So rather than trying to figure out what job an employer might be looking for perhaps in a few years' time and what sort of skills and competencies might be on the job ad that they might put up, it's better to invest in your personal success. And investing in your personal success means you invest in making an impact. When you learn to make an impact, then you have the secure, sustainable, fulfilling work life that you want. rather than the career game of chance that comes with answering job ads. Because if you think about it, it's very hard to stand out today. In the past, you'd go for a job and your only competitors were people with your experience who lived in the nearby area. We didn't know people who were more skilled than us, really. We typically didn't know billionaires or millionaires or biochemists or Mount Everest climbers or Harvard graduates or whatever your breed of rarity is. But today you theoretically could contact as many of those people as you like. And when everything's available, then nothing becomes special. But on the other hand, if you do know someone who has impact, then you know them straight away. I could name any profession, and if you know someone with impact, they're the names that will come to mind straight away. And you'll be able to tell me what's so good about them. And that's what you should be aiming for, to be impactful. Now, impact isn't about personality, which is something that I think is a misconception that comes through all the time, because we get a little bit swayed by what we see on social media and what we see on TV and in the news. An impactful person doesn't have to be any type of personality or any type of qualification or any gender or nationality or industry. In fact, you don't have to change who you are at all. And the ways to achieve impact start with dispelling two myths. And the first myth is that your skills determine your success. Skills aren't what make you valuable. And that's not just coming from me. We've got a survey by Robert Half just last year it was a fairly extensive survey, but the two important statistics that I thought you'd be interested in are that companies are willing to hire and train candidates 84% of the time if they lack the required skills, and 62% of the time they offer jobs to people that don't have the qualifications. Google is considered one of the best employers in the world to work for, and they certainly know what they're talking about. 115,000 workers over 50 countries. They assess their job applicants on 4 criteria, and skills is the last. Cognitive, personal, and culture-related come first. The second myth that we need to address is the scarcity of jobs. Now, it's easy for us to think that jobs are scarce because that's what we see in the environment around us. The whole system for jobs is competitive. You compete for the job interview, you compete for the job offer, you compete for the promotion, for the office, for the perks, for your employer's attention, for a little bit of budget. And that's trained us over the years to become very aware of scarcity. And we saw that scarcity come into play just a few months ago when people started hoarding commonplace goods. Now, toilet paper is not a scarce resource. It's not a limited resource. Hoarding was unnecessary, but that trigger of scarcity that we've been conditioned to have over the years that we've been working just kicked in very quickly. But when you've lost work and when you've lost your income or you've lost hours and you've been knocked back for jobs, it's pretty hard, I understand, to think that things aren't scarce. We struggle with just looking for the things we need. Many of us are facing serious setbacks, or we know someone who is. So by all means, when I say jobs aren't scarce, I don't mean to undermine at all the experiences that many people are going through. But I will explain a little bit more about what I mean. And in reality, it's not just the pandemic that's been eating into jobs. The job decimation's been going on for years. And here are just some headlines that have been, that I've just pulled very recently, that shows how dire our situation is meant to be. But we've been seeing the decimation of jobs for years. If you've been in retail or hospitality or any other number of industries that have been turning to things like gig workers, then you know that jobs haven't been secure for quite some time. And in this chart, it shows very simply the job gaps, so the jobs that we cannot fill in Australia, and that's been growing steadily. Had a little dip, of course, around the GFC, and it'll have a dip, of course, again, but the trend is up. And it's not just Australia. This is the graph from Europe, countries in Europe that are experiencing exactly the same number or proportion of jobs that cannot be filled. This is the one in from the US. And if you look at this one, there are 1 million jobs more unfilled than there are job seekers. Now, I know, of course, these graphs come before the pandemic, so I'll address that in just a moment. But here's the full trend from Indeed. Of course, Indeed, the job board that we often use to look for our jobs. And they show that the growing problem of jobs without workers is in both high and skilled positions, which contravenes some of the wisdoms that we've heard, that it's just the high skilled jobs that are being unfilled. Low skilled jobs also, and I do have a little bit of an explanation for that. And what is strange is that these charts don't look like the world we've been living in, where it felt like we just couldn't find the jobs we want, and a lot of people were settling for work that they didn't want. This is what the economists will call a jobs mismatch, and that's a perfect illustration of a jobs mismatch, when something that we've been trained for isn't what we need to have done. So how do we address this job mismatch? And I've got 4 tips for you, which I'd like to share with you now. The first one is switch your focus from jobs into work. We live in a job-centric world, as I referred to earlier. We've come to think of all work as jobs. In fact, when we talk about governments, talk about the economic growth, they almost always refer to jobs. But jobs actually provide a small percentage of all the work that people do. There is so much more work that contributes to our incomes and our economy that are not jobs. For example, contracting, business ownership, startups, partnerships, solo operators. And when you think of all the work that needs to be done, there's no such thing as work disappearing. For work to disappear, everyone would have to stop wanting anything. And we know that that's not going to happen, because humans have limitless ongoing needs and wants. We want solutions for maintaining and building relationships. We want to promote our happiness. We want to deal with anxiety. We want new experiences. We want to look after our physical selves, meet our legal obligations, follow our spiritual callings, and generally improve our personal situations in any number of ways. And we do that because we want comfortable, meaningful, and productive lives. So if we stopped buying, then we certainly would not have the lifestyles that we are all aiming for. And work is a byproduct of that human search for benefit and value. And as long as we value seekers, we'll always generate enough demand to provide work for everyone. I've created a little chart to try to illustrate the difference between work and jobs. Over on the right, you can see that jobs come about when there is a commercial set of production and exchange. So whether it is making goods or selling goods or delivering goods, that exchange, that transaction creates a job. Work, however, starts with needs and wants. Anytime there's a needs and want, let's say even an unpaid need, you need to brush your teeth, that's work. You go brush your teeth. You need to feed your children, that's work. Of course, that's not paid work. But as soon as we want to do it or want someone to do it, and we have a seek for benefit or value, the person who can provide that value is the person that has impact. If you think of someone like Elon Musk, for example, he believes that we need to populate Mars because Earth is going to be ruined before we know it. If we believe that's true, he's giving us the benefit of an extended life and through a new planet, and therefore he has impact. But if he just called himself a rocket ship builder, no one would ever have heard of him. And if you can get a handle on the difference between work and jobs, then you can use that to take control of your career. The second impact method is to think about capability, not skills. Now, in a job-centric world, we automatically think of everything as skills. Skills don't have impact. If you said your skill was repairing cars. Millions of people can repair cars. But if you said you have the capability of turning any old lemon into a roaring machine, then everyone will want your services. So just to talk about the difference between them, a skill is something you can do. It's just a straight out technical or knowledge-based ability. People use skills and capabilities interchangeably, but they're actually quite different. Sometimes people use skills and competencies interchangeably, and they're more related because most employers, when they talk about wanting a skill, they talk about wanting you to be competent in that skill. Where capability is different is it relates to a context. So it means, can you do a particular thing in any given set of circumstances and still achieve a result? So perhaps without a resource, running into a problem in a different environment, and you can still produce a result, then that's a capability. And just to give you an example, let's say I had the skill of being a public speaker. I go to a class, I go to a course, and I get taught all the tricks and tips. I now have a skill. Now, if I can actually do it, then you could say I'm competent at that skill. But what happens if the environment shifts? Could you still apply that skill to, let's say, a hostile crowd, to thousands of people, to very important people, to people who don't speak the same language? All those different scenarios or contexts, they're the tests of capability. And if you have an armory of enablers, like understanding and intuition and empathy and questioning and so on, then you have the ability to build your skills and turn them into capabilities. I've put up this image because it comes from Deloitte just in September last year, and they ran a survey on Australian jobs, and they found that we have a severe shortage of skills in customer service. So 5.5 million is that number, and if we go down a couple, the digital literacy gap is 3 million. And to someone who perhaps who lives in Australia, who knows that we are made up of hospitality and retail workers, as well as other service industries, it doesn't make sense that we seem to have a 5.5 million gap of jobs. So in other words, the statistic is saying of all the jobs we have that need customer service, 5.5 million of them have a gap within that area. And it's quite an incredible figure. And the reason for that figure, if you read that report, it's not that people can't do it, it's that we're missing the capability to do it in a world that is digitized, connected, virtual, distributed, and so on. So we have the skills, we just don't have enough people with the right capabilities for our current context. So the way to address that, I've just created a very simple flow, is to produce a context analysis. So if you were hypothetically going for a job and you wanted, or your employer asks you to do something about a customer service issue, you might have the skill, but you can use this chart to determine whether or not you have the capability to achieve what's required by consumers and their needs and wants ultimately. So you would ask, who am I doing it for? What am I expected to produce? How am I expected to produce these results? And what do they expect to see or experience? So if we applied this context analysis to, say, hospitality in June 2020 with lockdowns, who are we doing it for? Well, the customer might not have changed, but the way I'm doing it has changed. I might now need to serve customers who are at home, and I need to get that food to them to taste just as good as when I served it in my venue. How am I expected to produce these results? Can I add costs, such as the cost of delivery? Can I add equipment, such as food warmers? And what does a customer expect to see? And if I can achieve all these things, then I can say I don't have a customer service skill, I have a customer service capability. Our impact method number 3 is to operationalize your values. So if you recall that our definition of a good career is one in which you feel your work has meaning, then we're talking about your values. Now, if you're working in touch with your values, you're more likely to be happy you're doing it. which means you're more likely to do it more and better, which means you're probably going to develop expertise in it. A career without values is like getting into a boat and hoping the wind and waves will take you to your destination. You need equipment, you need motors or rudders or sails, and those things are your values. So I've turned values into 4 main subsets. The purpose we value, the identity we value, so who we are, the meaning we get, and the goals we pursue. If we can get all those in line, then we're able to talk about our values. What we find normally in, or perhaps in the past with employers, is they didn't really care so much about values. They just wanted you to do what you were told. But today, of course, we know that culture is important in organisations, and they know that if they can't demonstrate a good culture, it actually puts off a lot of their customers. And we see here some statistics, even though you might not be able to read the print, but basically it's customers that want to deal with organisations that can demonstrate their social or other values. So as companies favour or as consumers favour brands with a clear stand on purpose, organisations need to work through that in their culture, which means you need to be able to explain how your values fit in with the organisations that you wish to or are working for. And simply, the more you exercise your values with your skills, the more your capability will develop. And just to be clear, I'm talking about values that we operationalize, not necessarily your personal values that define you in your private life. So, for example, your religious values may not have anything to do with your professional values because you don't choose to operationalize them. I've talked about the importance of capabilities predominantly in the personal capability context, but there are other capabilities such as are listed here. They're all important, but of course I can't cover them all in one short session. Finally, the method that I want to share with you is an idea that you should always be outputting. And in a fast-paced, digitally or digital-centric, social media-driven community, we are always needing to be outputting. There's no such thing of a once and done anymore. And you probably know that if you've ever tried to get more followers, you can put out one great post, and if that's it, that's the end of it. So we get told in the old system by career advisors that you need to do things that look good on the CV, and that was fine in the past, but that's not it's not helpful anymore in a fast-changing, fast-paced world. Because if you think about it, the CV is simply an artifact. It's like your LinkedIn profile. It only tells people what may have happened or you may have done. It doesn't actually represent you necessarily very well or where you are right now. The other thing you often will focus on is the inputs. Should I go and study a course? Should I do this training? Shall I get more experience here? Should I do volunteer work? They're all inputs. They help you gather experience, and that experience is what you put on your CV. But today, impact comes from one thing only. It comes from outputting. It's the actions that you take to demonstrate your capability, because only when you output, people can see what you can do. If you don't take action, people don't even know you exist. And there are no points for inputs or artifacts. You don't get paid for going to school, for doing volunteer work, for writing new CVs, for writing cover letters, for applying online, for your LinkedIn profile. The only thing that pays is output. So if you are concentrating on getting momentum in your career, you have to focus on things that will actually get you paid. And if you don't have a job, which is the question I get asked all the time, if you don't have a job, then how do I output when no one will hire me, when all I can concentrate is on the artifact, the CVs and the profiles? Well, if you haven't got a job or you don't have anywhere to output, then you have to build your own stage. And I mean a metaphorical one, of course. The stage is, think of when you exercise your skills as a place where you go to practice and perform and perfect. It's where you go to showcase, and you make that showcase of your skills public to a specific audience. So if you think of some of the great successful people in history, like Einstein and Bill Gates and Branson, their success didn't come from their input. They left school early. They probably never wrote a CV. They only focused on what they could output. And when you've got your stage and you can output, you don't necessarily have to be the main star. So you might partner, for example, but don't just try to be the ensemble, which is where most jobs leave you. And to be noticed when it counts, you have to be noticeable all the time. It's not something you can do once and forget. Getting out there is hard, especially if you've lost your job or you're worried about your job. It is hard to take a risk. It's a comfort zone we don't like to break out of. But if we don't, then, well, we are where we are. If you can get out on a platform that you've designed for yourself, that's made up of your values, where you can exercise the skills that matter to you, that you enjoy using and that you're good at, and that you found a need or want that you can fulfill, then that's where you start to make impact. Coronavirus has taken millions of jobs and their incomes and sense of belonging. So I won't pretend it's easy, but not working when you want to, that's hard too. So to just wrap it up as an example, you know, few people would argue that the Beatles are one of the most successful bands in music history. And it's natural to say that their success is because of their talents or their combined abilities. But it wasn't actually that story at all. They found a stage, literally in their case, in Hamburg, that asked bands to play 8-hour gigs to attract customers. And they played all night for 8 hours longs. They played anything and everything they could think of. And from all accounts, they weren't very good at it either. But it was only because they performed hours after hour after hour. And for people who spoke a foreign language, the way John Lennon put it, they had to try even harder. They had to put their heart and soul into it to get themselves over. If you're interested in that story, that comes from Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, which is a fantastic read if you're into these sorts of facts on success. So insecurity is hard, and I do understand it's lonely, but don't forget there is a lag. You're not going to see success straight away, just as we're not going to know what this new world of our normal will look like straight away. But that's why we've got to be testing and doing things as we go, so that when the world comes right, or our skills build up, or we find our audience, we've been practiced and we're ready. So just in summary, 4-part method for life security and satisfaction: focus on work, your work, not an employer's job. Build your capabilities, use your core skills to operationalize your values, and just keep outputting. Give, not take value. So before I wrap up, I'd like to make an offer to the Victory Office community, and that's a 50% discount on the copy of the book. If you are interested, I've created a special page that's not available to the public, which is at that URL, and the book will be available to you at half price. Final word, just a quick recognition of Michelangelo, who was the metaphor of the book. And it's hard to believe that someone so talented was actually just like us. He had a fear of failing, and he lost his job, and he thought he would never find another job. He lost his job because his patron, who was the Pope, as it turns out, died. And he said that he learned a valuable lesson from that, and that is to become something of worth and value is the best and safest course. So despite the fact that Michelangelo was only ever trained as a painter, his greatest works are sculpting, fresco painting, and architecture, which he had to teach himself because he realized that's what his customers needed. And if that effort isn't remarkable enough, his competitors at the time were Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael and Botticelli and Donatello. So he wasn't just great because no one else around him was available. He had to really fight for his position. And of course, he was always looking over his shoulder to see what his competitors were up to. I realise it's actually quite hard to take in so many changes in a very short presentation, a very quick presentation. So there is something that I'd like to make available to the Victory Office's community, and that is a program that I'm putting together which covers the skills for the digital workforce, which will launch a beta version in a couple of weeks' time. Because, you know, I believe that everyone should have the right to work if they want it. And I've put together a program called Up Level, which will be at no cost to our early test users as a thank you for being part of an early journey. And also it will be lifetime. So if you join us, you'll be there for as long as you want to. And the goal is not just to give you the sorts of material that's broken down into workable modules, but to keep coming through with experts in our fields, whatever those fields may be, so that as our problems arise and as our world changes, there's always access to a panel who can help with your specific questions. And if you're interested, just simply let me know. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'll share my my code on the next screen. Please email me, or if you'd like to chat, just book a time on my Calendly account. So on that note, let me share my LinkedIn code. And I thank you very much for your attention and for allowing me to share with you.
Thank you so much, Isabel. That was incredible and so full of information. During that, I had to let everyone know where they could eventually find this as well, because we are doing a recording of this. It will be up in our V library, because I was just so busy making notes that I was like, you were scanning through slides, and I was like, oh no, like that's such an interesting fact. That's such an interesting statistic, and yeah, I feel like there's absolutely the opportunity to really deep dive into this. I was really intrigued about the difference between being capable instead of focusing on your skills. And I know you mentioned quickly that a couple of, qualities in someone who's capable, which was, I think, being empathetic. What can you tell me some of the other skills of being capable as opposed to just being skilled?
Some of it depends on the context. So, for example, we could say the pilot whose name escapes me right now, who saved all these people when the plane came down on the Hudson River. He had more than skills. He had a capability that allowed him to sense a situation very quickly. So in his case, it was he used a skill or a capability, or this kind of enabling skill called pattern matching. And he realized very quickly that the patterns that a pilot should see wasn't the pattern presenting to him at the time. And so he reacted before there were actually any real signs of trouble. So in that case, that's a particular skill. But resilience is one, skills to manage your mindset is another. Concentration is a skill. Sales ability. We're in a world where everyone's always got something, and we're always trying to be more innovative and more collaborative. So, and I was talking to a number of talent managers to say that if they could get more people in any job with a sales ability, that would help them immensely, because the quiet people tend to often have great ideas that no one hears because they're the quiet people. So design thinking is another. I know that's a skill in its own right, but it's also a very handy skill to help people manage other problems. Problem solving, innovative, ideating. There are so many.
Beautiful. Well, look, I'm really conscious of time, so I think we have to wrap up, unfortunately. But once again, thank you so much. We all know where to find you, but obviously I'll contact everybody after this, especially those who've included their LinkedIn, so we can connect afterward, and I will include all of that information. There is also a book that is up for grabs. I will be doing a little draw tomorrow morning, and we'll email the lucky winner of that book as well. So once again, Isabel, thank you so much for joining us. And everybody for tuning in. I know some of you had to go off and have dinner, but thank you for joining us as well. I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye all.
everybody.
Bye.
See you.